The steam rising from the thick ceramic mugs was the only thing moving in the quiet corner of the roadside diner. Outside, a line of polished chrome and black steel motorcycles sat patiently under the pale morning sun, their engines cool for the first time in hours. Inside, the men who rode them were just as still, a wall of weathered leather and denim occupying the largest booth. They were the Iron Sentinels, a name that meant different things to different people. But here, this morning, they were just men enjoying a rare moment of peace. Hawk, the chapter president, nursed his black coffee. His face was a roadmap of long miles and hard sun, but his eyes were clear and watchful. Across from him, Grizz, a man built like a refrigerator with a beard that seemed to have its own weather system, was methodically working his way through a stack of pancakes. Flanking them were Doc, whose steady hands were as skilled with a suture kit as a wrench, and Trace, a wiry man whose gaze missed nothing, a holdover from a past life he never spoke of. The air was thick with the smell of bacon and brewing coffee. A comfortable silence settled over their table. They ate with the easy familiarity of men who had shared more than just meals. They had shared storms, breakdowns, and the unspoken burdens that led them to this life on two wheels. They were a brotherhood, misunderstood by the world, but perfectly understood by each other. This diner was a neutral ground, a place where their vests and patches earned them wary glances, but little more. That peace was shattered not by a shout, but by a whisper of motion. A small boy, no older than 7, materialized at the edge of their booth. He was a ghost in a faded t-shirt and jeans, his feet bare and his face pale with a terror so profound it seemed to suck the very warmth from the air around him. His eyes, wide and dark, were locked on the coffee mugs sitting in front of the bikers. The chatter of the other patrons, the clatter of cutlery, it all faded into a dull hum. Grizz paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. Hawk slowly lowered his mug, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the boy's trembling frame. The kid's chest was heaving, his breaths coming in ragged, silent gasps. He looked like a fawn cornered by wolves, except he had run toward the biggest wolves in the forest. He finally found his voice, a reedy, desperate sound that cut through the diner's morning calm like a shard of glass. He pointed a shaking finger at Hawk's mug. "Don't," he whispered, the word cracking. "Don't drink that coffee." The other patrons, who had been stealing glances at the bikers, now stared openly. A waitress froze mid-stride, her pot of coffee held aloft. The cook peered through the service window. For a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Bystanders saw a scared kid talking to men they were already afraid of. They were paralyzed by uncertainty, caught between fear of the bikers and the strange, urgent drama unfolding before them. Hawk didn't hesitate. He didn't question or dismiss. He saw the raw, undiluted fear in the boy's eyes, and in his world, that kind of fear was a truth more reliable than any sworn statement. He pushed his own mug away, then reached out and placed a steady hand on Grizz's arm, stopping him from taking another sip. His voice was low and calm, a stark contrast to the boy's panic. "Nobody touches the coffee." The words rippled down the booth. Doc and Trace immediately pushed their mugs toward the center of the table, their movements fluid and certain. They looked at Hawk, awaiting the next command. Their reaction was instantaneous, a machine of 4 parts moving as one. While the rest of the diner was a tableau of shock, the Iron Sentinels were already in motion. A man in a crisp white apron and a practiced smile began to emerge from behind the counter. He was Martin, the owner. He was handsome in a bland, forgettable way, with neatly combed hair and a friendly demeanor that he wore like a uniform. "Well now, what's all this commotion?" he asked, his voice oozing a false, syrupy concern. He directed his smile at the boy. "Leo, what are you doing bothering these gentlemen? Come on, son, back to the kitchen." Leo flinched as if struck, pressing himself against the leather of the booth, trying to melt into the biker's protective shadow. He shook his head violently, his eyes still wide with terror. He wouldn't look at Martin. Hawk didn't take his eyes off the boy, but he spoke to the approaching owner. The boy said not to drink the coffee, he stated simply. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. A new, unchangeable fact in their world. Martin's smile tightened just a fraction. "Oh, kids," he said with a dismissive chuckle, waving a hand. "You know how they are. Wild imaginations. Probably just a game." He tried to project an air of weary paternalism, the respectable business owner dealing with a minor disturbance. "I assure you, gentlemen, my coffee is the best in 3 counties, freshly ground this morning." He reached for Hawk's mug, intending to remove the object of controversy. "Let me get you all a fresh pot on the house." His movements were smooth, meant to be disarming, the actions of a man completely in control of his domain. But Hawk's hand shot out, not touching Martin, but hovering just over the mug, a silent and absolute denial of permission. The air crackled with sudden tension. "I don't think you will," Hawk said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that was more felt than heard. It was the sound of gravel grinding under a heavy tire. "We're going to sit here and have a little chat about the coffee and about your boy, Leo." Martin's mask of pleasantry began to show cracks. "He's not my boy," he snapped, the friendly tone gone, replaced by a sharp edge of irritation. "He's the son of one of my waitresses. Now, if you'll excuse me, you're making my other customers nervous." He gestured vaguely at the rest of the diner, where patrons were now trying very hard to pretend they weren't listening to every word. "They should be nervous," Trace interjected, his voice quiet but carrying an unnerving intensity. He hadn't moved, but his eyes were scanning Martin, dissecting him piece by piece. "We are." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Martin, why would a little boy, who's clearly terrified of you, run over to a table of strangers to warn them about the coffee you just served?" The question hung in the air, simple, logical, and utterly damning. Martin's face flushed a dull red. His friendly facade was crumbling under the weight of 4 pairs of calm, unblinking eyes. He was used to being in charge, to his smile being enough to smooth over any problem. But his smile had no effect on these men. They weren't looking at the friendly diner owner. They were looking right through him at the ugly thing hiding underneath. "This is ridiculous," Martin sputtered, his voice rising. "I'm not going to be interrogated in my own establishment by the likes of you." He puffed out his chest, a desperate attempt to regain his authority. "This is a family place. I'm a respected member of this community." "We're not the ones who brought this up," Grizz rumbled, his deep voice making the table vibrate slightly. "The kid did." He gestured with his chin toward Leo, who was still huddled against the booth. "And right now, his opinion matters a whole lot more to us than yours." Martin's eyes darted around the diner, seeking an ally, a sympathetic face. He found none. He saw only fear and suspicion. He had lost control of the narrative, and it was making him frantic. His gaze fell on the kitchen doors, a flicker of calculation in his eyes. Escape. Bad choice. Very bad choice. Trace saw the shift, the minute tightening of muscles, the glance toward the exit. "You run a clean kitchen, Martin?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. "Everything up to code, no expired products, no misplaced containers." Martin's eyes snapped back to Trace. "What are you implying?" he hissed, the last of his composure evaporating. "I'm not implying anything," Trace said, his voice as cold and sharp as ice. "I'm looking at the way your hand is trembling. I'm looking at the sweat on your upper lip. And I'm looking at this boy who saw something he wasn't supposed to see." He turned his piercing gaze to Leo. "What did you see, kid?" The boy swallowed hard, gathering a sliver of courage from the fortress of leather surrounding him. He pointed a trembling finger toward the kitchen. He put something in the pot, Leo whispered, his voice barely audible. From a little bottle, the one he keeps under the sink with the skull on it. He told my mom it was for the rats. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the diner. The word rats echoed in the space, and everyone understood. The friendly diner owner, the community man, had tried to poison them. His target was clear, the men whose presence he despised, whose very existence in his establishment was an affront to his sense of order. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Martin's face contorted into a mask of pure, undiluted rage. The pretense was over. You little brat, he snarled, lunging not for the door, but for the boy. It was a stupid, impulsive act of fury, the last gambit of a cornered animal. He never made it. Grizz's arm, as thick as a tree limb, shot out and clamped down on Martin's shoulder. It wasn't a punch or a shove. It was simply an immovable object meeting a pathetic force. Martin was stopped dead, his forward momentum absorbed completely. Grizz's fingers dug into the man's collarbone, and a choked gasp of pain escaped Martin's lips. With a single, effortless motion, Grizz lifted Martin off his feet and slammed him back against the counter. A rack of pie plates clattered to the floor. The sound broke the spell that had held the other patrons captive. Someone screamed. Another fumbled for their phone, dialing 911. Martin was done. He slumped against the counter, held in place by Grizz's unyielding grip, his face a mess of shock, fear, and impotent fury. The respectable businessman was gone, replaced by a common thug who had been caught. The story of Martin, the diner owner, could have ended there, a simple police matter of attempted murder. But for the Iron Sentinels, it had just begun. Because they understood that the poison in the coffee was only a symptom of a much deeper sickness. As the sirens wailed in the distance, their attention shifted from the neutralized threat to the small boy who had saved them, and the question of what or who he needed saving from. Before we continue this story, take a moment. We often see people who look different from us, and we make assumptions. But as we've just seen, appearances can be deceiving, and a hero can be hidden beneath a leather vest, just as a monster can be hidden behind a friendly smile. If you believe that true character is about actions, not appearances, then show your support. Like this story, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments what you think makes a true hero. Doc slid out of the booth, his movements calm and reassuring. He knelt in front of Leo, making himself smaller, less intimidating. "Hey there, little man," he said softly. "My name's Doc. You were very brave just now. Are you okay?" Leo stared at him, his terror slowly beginning to recede. Replaced by a cautious curiosity, he gave a tiny, jerky nod. Doc's eyes scanned him, a quick, professional assessment. No immediate physical injuries, but the boy was deep in shock. "Where's your mom?" Doc asked gently. Leo's eyes flickered toward the kitchen doors. Just then they swung open, and a woman stumbled out. She was thin and worn, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant fear. Her waitress uniform was rumpled, and there was a fresh bruise blooming on her cheek. This was Sarah, Leo's mother. Her eyes darted from the scene at the counter, Martin pinned by Grizz, the shattered plates, to her son huddled with the bikers. A wave of panic washed over her face. "Leo!" she cried, rushing forward. But she stopped short, her fear of Martin warring with her maternal instinct. Hawk stood up, placing himself between her and the counter. He created a safe space with his presence alone. "It's all right," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "He's safe. You both are." He looked at the bruise on her face, and a cold, hard understanding settled in his gut. The poison in the coffee pot was just the tip of the iceberg. Sarah looked at him. then at her son being tended to by Doc, and something inside her, held taut for so long, finally snapped. A sob escaped her, and she covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. The wail of the sirens grew louder, culminating in the flashing red and blue lights that swept across the diner's windows. 2 sheriff's deputies entered, their hands resting on their sidearms, their faces grim as they took in the chaotic scene. They were followed by Sheriff Brody, a tall, weathered man who had been dealing with the Iron Sentinels for the better part of a decade. Brody's eyes met Hawk's over the heads of the cowering patrons. There was no love lost between them, but there was a grudging respect. Brody knew Hawk's word was his bond, and he knew the Sentinels had their own rigid code. They were trouble, but they were never random, and they never lied to him. "Hawk," Brody said, his voice a tired drawl, "mind telling me why my quiet morning has been interrupted by half the town calling in a riot at the diner, and why you've got Martin Cole pinned to his own counter?" "Ask the kid," Hawk replied, nodding toward Leo. "He's the hero today." He then gave the sheriff a concise, factual account of what had happened, leaving out no detail from the boy's warning to Martin's confession by action. Trace added what Leo had seen about the bottle with the skull on it. While they talked, the deputies cuffed a sputtering, threatening Martin. As they led him away, he twisted his head, his eyes burning with hate, locking onto Sarah. "You'll pay for this, you and that little rat," he snarled. "You're nothing without me. You'll be on the street. I'll find you." Before Brody could even tell him to shut up, Hawk stepped into his line of sight, a solid wall of leather and resolve. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "No, you won't," he said, his voice flat and cold as a winter tombstone. It was not a threat. It was a promise, a statement of absolute fact. "You will never see them again. You will never speak their names again. If you do, the last thing you'll ever see is us. We'll be waiting." Martin's face went pale. The bluster and rage drained away, replaced by a sudden, primal fear. He had threatened a woman and her child. He had just realized he had done so in front of men who took such things personally. He stumbled as the deputies pushed him out the door, a broken, pathetic man whose power had vanished the moment he was challenged. With Martin gone, a semblance of order returned. The other patrons began to give their statements, their initial fear of the bikers now replaced by a dawning sense of gratitude. They had all been drinking that coffee. That small, terrified boy and the men they had stereotyped had just saved their lives. Hawk turned to Sarah, who was now holding a sleeping Leo in her arms, the boy finally succumbing to exhaustion. "You and your son need a safe place to go," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears and a helplessness that tore at him. "I have nowhere," she whispered. "He was right. I have nothing. He controlled everything. My job, my apartment. It was all tied to him." "Not anymore," Hawk said. "Our clubhouse has an empty apartment upstairs. It's clean. It's safe. You can stay as long as you need. We'll handle the rest." Later that day, back at the Iron Sentinels' fortress-like clubhouse, the chapter gathered around their heavy oak table. The mood was somber. Leo and Sarah were asleep upstairs, the first peaceful sleep they'd had in years. "This is gonna be complicated, Hawk," a younger member named Rook said, voicing the practical concerns. "Taking them in, that's a big commitment. We'll have Martin's friends, maybe family, sniffing around." Grizz slammed a heavy fist on the table, making the beer bottles jump. "Let 'em sniff," he growled. "They'll find us. That kid saved our lives, all of us. We were all drinking that coffee. End of story. We owe him. We owe them." Hawk silenced the debate with a raised hand. "Grizz is right. We don't turn our backs. Not on this. That woman and her boy are under the protection of this club now. That is final." He looked around the table, his gaze locking with each member. We find her a new job. We find her a new place, a permanent one. We make sure she has money to start over, and we make it known in no uncertain terms that they are not to be touched. Anyone with a problem with that can see me. No one had a problem with that. The Iron Sentinels were more than a club. They were a family forged in hardship. They understood what it meant to have nothing and no one. Their code was simple. You protect those who can't protect themselves. News of what happened at the diner spread through the small town like wildfire. The story changed in the telling, but the core facts remained. The town's smiling diner owner was a monster, and the town's menacing bikers were heroes. People who used to cross the street to avoid them now nodded in respect. The next day, Sheriff Brody showed up at the clubhouse. He didn't come with a warrant. He came with a box of groceries and a grudging look on his face. "Don't get used to this," he grumbled, setting the box down. "The town's taking up a collection for Sarah and the boy. Figured I'd drop this by." He looked at Hawk. "You did a good thing. Just try to stay out of my jail for a while." He left before Hawk could reply. A few days later, Sarah, looking more rested than they had ever seen her, came down from the apartment. She found Hawk in the garage, meticulously cleaning a carburetor. She stood there for a moment, watching his large, tattooed hands work with such delicate precision. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice quiet. "I don't understand. Everyone has always looked away. You didn't even know us. Why are you doing all of this for me and my son?" Hawk stopped his work and wiped his hands on a rag. He turned to face her, his expression serious. He thought for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because we know what it's like," he said, his voice low, "to be the one nobody sees, the one people look right through because it's easier." He gestured to Grizz, who was working on his own bike nearby. "You see that big, ugly man over there?" he said, a rare hint of a smile touching his lips. "When he was 10, his old man used to use him as a punching bag. He'd hide in a closet, praying someone would notice the bruises, that someone would step in. Nobody ever did. He promised himself if he ever got big enough, he'd be the one who stepped in." He then nodded toward Doc, who was organizing medical supplies. Doc grew up in the system, bounced from one foster home to another. He knows what it's like to be powerless, to have your whole life in someone else's hands. Finally, his gaze fell on his own reflection in a piece of chrome. "And me," he said, his voice softer now. "I was a lot like your Leo, small, scared. I watched my mother suffer at the hands of a man who was supposed to love her. A man everyone in town thought was a pillar of the community. I remember screaming for help once, and the neighbors just closed their curtains." He looked back at Sarah, his eyes holding a lifetime of pain and resolve. "We're not good men, Sarah. The world will tell you that, and maybe they're right. But we have a rule. We protect the ones the world forgets. We answer the calls nobody else hears. Your son didn't just save us from some poison. He reminded us of who we are. He called, and we answered." Tears streamed down Sarah's face, but for the first time, they were not tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude. That evening, Leo came downstairs clutching a piece of paper. He shyly handed it to Hawk. It was a crayon drawing. In it, a giant, smiling monster labeled Martin was looming over a small house. But standing in front of the house were 4 figures in black vests with sentinels scrawled on the back. They were holding shields, and one of them, a big one with a beard, was punching the monster in the nose. In the doorway of the little house stood a small boy and his mother, holding hands and smiling under a brightly colored sun. Hawk stared at the drawing for a long time. He then walked over to the clubhouse's main wall, a place reserved for fallen brothers' patches and club honors. He carefully tacked the drawing right in the center. It became a sacred object, a testament to their code. 1 year later, the town was different. The old diner was boarded up, a monument to a dark secret. But a few blocks down, a new, brighter cafe had opened called the Sunrise Grill. Behind the counter stood Sarah, no longer haunted and thin, but confident and vibrant, the proud owner of her own business. The Iron Sentinels had pooled their resources, called in favors, and given her the startup capital, a loan she was already paying back with interest. Leo was no longer a ghost. He was a bright, happy 8-year-old, the star of his little league team. His best friends were the biggest, scariest-looking men in town, who showed up to every one of his games, their thunderous cheers drowning out all the others. The Iron Sentinels were different, too. They were still outsiders, still men who lived by their own rules, on the edge of society. But they were no longer just feared, they were respected. They had become the town's unlikely guardians, the keepers of a promise made in a quiet diner. In the clubhouse, Leo's drawing remained in its place of honor, framed now behind glass. It was a constant reminder, a reminder that sometimes the most important warnings come from the smallest voices. It was a reminder that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about acting in spite of it. Real heroes are not defined by the uniform they wear or the judgment of the world. They are defined by their choices in the moments that matter. They are forged in the fires of their own past, and they carry the scars not as a weakness, but as a map that guides them toward those who are lost and in pain. They answer the calls they never expected to receive, proving that sometimes the hardest men carry the softest hearts, and the most powerful protection can be found in the shadow of a brotherhood bound by more than just the road.